Let's begin by asking, how and why did you get involved with this organization?
So I have to try to come up with a brief version, because the full version would take a day.
Right. But I'm willing to have you take your time because I'll edit it out.
Okay, so so I'm not. I've never been a full member or a member of a cultic group. How I got involved in this, to go all the way back to the beginning, would be the fact that my parents are both Holocaust survivors, and and therefore I grew up with stories about Nazi Germany, and had a real, I can only describe it as a gut level, visceral distaste for totalitarianism. That has been true for as long back as I can remember, and like a lot of other children of Holocaust survivors, this has been documented. Other kids were having fantasies about pretending to be cowboy and Indian. I was having fantasies about being in the underground in Nazi Germany, and rebelling against the totalitarian governments and things like that. So it starts off with, my involvement starts off with this real sort of general and very visceral distaste for anything that impacts, that denies human freedom. That's the bottom line. Fast forward to my first couple of years in college. I was at Columbia from 1972 to 1976. And the Collegiate Association for Research and Principle, CARP, was very active on campus, and of course CARP was the front group for the Unification Church. I would engage in, I'll call them conversations. I don't know, there's not a proper word, not a better word I can think of right now. But I would talk with people in CARP, and I noticed pretty quickly that there was absolutely nothing that I was saying that was getting through to them. That there was no. I always felt that especially in college, you have these discussions, and I may change a little bit, you may change. There's an interaction there. There's a mutual influencing going on, and that's the basis, of course, for all ethical communication. With the members of CARP, it was one way. I mean, nothing I said induced anything other than what seemed to be a scripted response, and a stereotyped, rigid, scripted response. So I began thinking, what's going on with these people? Why, I was used to a lot of debate, but I was never used to the level of, dogmatic, talk that they were engaging in. Okay, so I was originally a political science major. I switched to psychology in the second semester of my junior year. It's rather late, and I had taken a lot of psychology. I had taken social psychology with a professor who, to this day, is the best professor I've ever had. Well known in the field of attachment now, Dr. Philip Shaver. So I proposed to Phil that I do an independent study. And the independent study involved, I said, I want to develop a survey, and I'm going to start attending the CARP meetings, and I'm going to allow them to recruit me. But I'm also going to say I'm a psychology student, and I want to do this survey, et cetera, et cetera. So I attended the CARP meetings for probably a month or two, and then was asked if I would be interested in going to the 1-week training in Barrytown. The Unification Church was never mentioned at this point, so it was a CARP training. So I knew it was Unification Church. I already knew that because I'd I'd investigated this group, but there was no mention to anyone else that this had any connection with Moon. So I developed a survey, and I allowed myself to be recruited for the 7-day workshop in Barrytown in upstate New York. Coincidentally, my roommate at that time, my college roommate, was taking social psychology with a different professor of mine, and he wrote a term paper on thought reform. And he went through Robert Lifton, he went through Edgar Schein, and literally a day or two, or maybe even on the train ride up to Barrytown, I can't remember exactly when, but it was really just before I went up there, I read the paper. So I get up there, and after 2 days, I realize, whoa, what's going on here is exactly what Ken described in his paper on thought reform. So I went up there, wanted to do this survey. Of course, the minute I started to do the survey, I was immediately called out. They confiscated my surveys, even though I'd gotten permission beforehand. So my survey, conducting the survey was no longer part of my study. So instead, what I wound up doing was, when I got back, I wound up writing up my experiences in Barrytown, comparing them to Lifton and comparing it to Edgar Schein. As far as I know, and this is my call to not my call to fame, my call to shame, because Phil Shaver said, we ought to write an article together about this, and I said that's a great idea. But summer came. He actually left Columbia and went to NYU, and I got caught up in whatever the heck I was doing that summer. So the article never got written, which is a shame, because it would have been the first article. It would have been the very first article on Moonies and cults using thought reform.
Wow.
At any rate, I wrote the paper, and my senior year, beginning my senior year of college, I had to start thinking of applying to grad school. And I had okay grades. They weren't brilliant grades. I had decent GREs, nothing that, graduate PhD programs in psychology are incredible, more selective than med school. So, so I applied, and I thought, I'm going to attach this paper to my application, because it's kind of an interesting paper. It's a little unique. Maybe that would help. Well, I got a couple of interviews, but I got called in to an interview. It was initially a group interview at University of Pennsylvania, and of course I went and did the group interview, and then Art Dole, who was the chair of the department at that time, called me aside and said he wanted to talk to me about the paper. So, and Bob, you knew Art. I mean, Art was one of the hardest people to read I've ever known. I mean, he mastered the poker face. I mean, unbelievably difficult to read. Even as long as I knew him, it was tough to read. So he's asking me about the paper, and I'm telling him, I'm going, oh, this organization, Unification Church, is doing brainwashing. They're evil. They're this or that and the other. I go through this for like a half an hour, and he just looks at me very deadpan, very just totally neutrally, says, my daughter's in the Unification Church. First thought that goes through my mind was, I just blew it. Here I am spending a half an hour insulting his daughter's church. Well, little did I know, I didn't know this until much later. Little did I know that Art didn't know what the Unification Church was. So this is the first he'd ever heard of what they were doing. Fast forward several years, I mean, Art eventually, had his daughter deprogrammed. That's another story in and of itself. But I'm expecting a rejection letter from Penn, obviously, But instead, not only do I get an acceptance letter, but I get a scholarship. So I'm like, whoa. Of course, I accepted the offer. I had no idea how I was going to pay for graduate school, so that was a pretty big break. And basically, I went to Penn on the condition that I would be doing my doctoral dissertation in some area related to cult processes. So of course, years later, I did do my dissertation, which was on deprogramming. But in the meantime, I had to and wanted to immerse myself in the literature. I began interviewing people. I interviewed the second person, I think, the second case that Ted Patrick described in his book. I interviewed that young man. Very eye-opening. What he told me he experienced, he was out of the group, but what he told me he experienced under while being deprogrammed by Ted Patrick was pretty horrible. So that really threw me for a loop. But I continued to delve into this. I attended my first CAN meeting in 1981 in Tampa, and met Ted Patrick there. Met a lot of the other people who were involved with CAN and still involved with ICSA, some of them, and that's basically how it started. I mean, then when I first found out about AFF, it felt to me like that was really probably going to be more, that's going to be the organization I'd be more active in, because it was more academic, mental health oriented. I had gone through a bizarre vetting process in order to go to the CAN conference. It was 2-hour, honestly, it was an interrogation by officials in CAN, who for whatever reason were highly suspicious. I think they were just very suspicious of anyone who had academic intentions. And I was honest about that. I said, this is what I want to do for my dissertation on. Don't know what, but something related to cults. And even though Art Dole, who at that time was already pretty active in CAN, even with his letter of introduction, so to speak, it didn't matter. I got really thoroughly interrogated, which really put me off quite a bit. So, I met Michael Langoni. I think I met him at a CAN conference in Philadelphia, but my memory is probably fuzzy there.
Maybe it was at that meeting. You remember that meeting at Penn where we gave some talks?
Yeah, I'm sure that's what it was. Yeah, that was
the only time I've ever been to Penn.
Because what's her name was also there, who I over the years come to admire tremendously. Blocking on it. She's a PhD nurse who ultimately worked with John Douglas on rapists and homicide. It'll come to me. Her name will come to me. I'm blocking on it right now. But she was there talking about primarily talking about satanic abuse, which is a whole separate topic.
Was it Linda? Linda Blood?
No. It was.
That's not important.
It may or may not come to me. She ultimately became really well known because she partnered with John Douglas, who was the founder, I think the first director of the behavioral science unit of the FBI. Silence of the Lambs is based on him, and now there's a show, Mind Hunters, that's all about John Douglas in his early years. So she did research. They're the ones who developed the homicidal triad, and they did a lot of. They're the ones who did all the interviewing of serial killers and serial rapists. That is kind of depicted in Silence of the Lambs. So
was Art involved with the AFF at that time?
Yeah, Art was involved, sure. So it seemed to me that AFF was, much more the organization that I would feel comfortable with, and so I, became somewhat involved. I mean, I had no real leadership position. I don't remember. Don't think I did any, if any, presentations or anything. In Stony Point in 1991, I received, I was a co-recipient of the Jack Clark Award after I finished my dissertation and published it as a special issue of the Cultic Studies Journal.
I remember.
Meanwhile, I linked up with Stephen and Roberta Eisenberg and another couple of other people, eventually also Pat Ryan and then eventually Joe Kelly, and we Linda Duber Marshall, and we formed RETIRN, the Reentry Therapy Information and Referral Network, and we began working on cases, primarily prepping families and post-intervention counseling and therapy. And then that even spilled over into the forensic area. especially Linda at that time, and I as well began, doing expert testimony in cult-related cases. As I mentioned in my one of my remarks at this week, probably the single thing that I'm most proud of is the fact that we took down a pretty big psychotherapy cult in the Philadelphia suburban area.
What were the grounds for finding that? Was it a criminal finding?
No,
civil?
It sure as hell should have been, but law enforcement treats this whole area very differently than we do. The fact that Patty Hearst was convicted tells you a lot. I mean, if there's anyone who is more clearly a brainwashing victim, of course, that was recognized later on with her pardon, but I'm still convinced that if she hadn't been a Hearst, she would have gotten, she would have not been found guilty. But I think there was a lot of backlash against her wealth. So anyway, so we started doing clinical work. So we started writing some articles based on our clinical work. I did my dissertation. Kind of pulled out for a little while because I had other things that I was doing and being deeply involved with, and then eventually came back into the fold.
Can you go into that coming back into the fold? Obviously, you became more involved.
Yeah.
Exactly how?
Well, I was asked to be on the board.
Okay.
So.
Did you make policy?
Well, I think we all have, but there's not that much policy to make. So we're really more involved with just planning and that sort of thing. But our big policy position that we worked very hard on and was published a few years ago had to do with the openness, open dialogue at ICSA conferences. Just every year, including right now. Every year there is some group of people who comes up to us, or one or more people who comes up to us and says, how can you let so-and-so talk here? They are this or that and the other thing. This is terrible. ICSA is facilitating this abuse, or ICSA is facilitating that. Now it's, today it's, ICSA is facilitating Chinese government propaganda. I think it's very difficult for people to understand that this is what we're doing. I mean, if you want to form an anti-cult organization or whatever, or an anti-Chinese government organization, go right ahead. This is our organization. We're going to run it the way we want it. So,
broadly speaking, intellectually and in practical matters, has the involvement with ICEP, or ICEP, produced any change in your approach to things?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you just mentioned, of course, a fundamental one.
Yeah. I mean, my initial work, I used to work in conjunction with a few deprogrammers, and my doctoral dissertation, of course, involved a participant observation, as well as a quantitative analysis of one single deprogramming. Over a period of time, it became more and more clear to me that deprogramming, aside from the legal issues that are involved, that deprogramming often had harmful effects. And so we have become much more, I have become much more understanding and receptive to the more gradual approaches. I no longer believe the way I did rather naively, let's say in the late 70s and early 80s. I no longer believe that we can shut down the cults. I think that is an absolutely impossible task. So a major shift, I would say, in ICSA came when we began to have private conversations with a few representatives of what is generally thought of as the reform movement in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON. And we met with their representatives, and the primary representative who is here at this, who comes to almost all of our conferences, and he's here this week. Primary representative is Anuta Madas, and after a few years of dialogue, we invited them to come, and we had a very controversial but very important panel discussion. Krishna's, and I think one or two other representatives perhaps, and then a number of us. It's Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly and myself, and there are a couple of other people, and to make a long story short, we have decided that when we see a genuine movement within a cultic organization to try to liberalize and open up, and of course, hopefully transition the group away from being as cultic as it is.
This reminds me, I remember while I was still more deeply involved, that some of the evangelical Christian groups seem to be amenable to looking into the ethics of how they operated. Is that something that's
sure, there's the
considered an achievement?
Oh yeah, it was I don't know if it was a College Crusade for Christ, or I think
it was
or intercollegiate.
That's it.
Yeah, intercollegiate something for Christ.
Yeah.
We had. I wasn't involved in this, but Michael Langoni and others were involved in developing a code of ethics for evangelical proselytizing. But the bottom line is, large arms of organized Christianity, they are doctrinally required in a sense to try to convert people. And so the issue becomes, well, can that be done ethically, or it's clearly being done unethically in a lot of cases. We're not going to get rid of it, so can it be done more ethically? So I think AFF has, ICSA has moved from being an anti-cult organization to being a counter-cult organization to being a cult-aware organization. And I think that it's necessary for our survival. I mean, CAN got sued out of existence, as we all know. There are all kinds of legal issues when you have closed meetings. This was Herb Rosedale was the one who, I guess was he the first president of ICSA? I think he may have been the first, not the first president of AFF, but I think he was the first president. He was president when the name was changed to ICSA.
That's right.
And Herb being, a brilliant attorney and so good at dealing with many different kinds of people. It was Herb who convinced us that we need to take a position that's different from CAN, that it is possible to be an open organization and still maintain, our set of core principles. And I think we've been successful at that.
Yeah. How about the question of influencing people in your field, in your academic field? Have you tried to do that?
Yes. That's an ongoing debate right now. There are a significant number of people, and I actually, I would include myself, at least to some degree, in agreement with them, who wish to decrease the amount of talk that we're doing about cults and talk more about coercion. And so, I feel strongly that ICSA needs to broaden its appeal, and we're doing that. We are working on that. We're, by developing links with groups that are that oppose coercion of all kinds, radical groups that are opposing Islamic radicalization, groups that are opposing human trafficking. I think we are slowly but surely beginning to have a lot of cross-pollination, so that, you know, for example, people in the field of intimate partner violence, yeah, which of course, you know, I was part of a presentation on. You know, we're working to get people to understand that this is not some bizarre, weird, esoteric, strange, unusual phenomenon that I always talk about. I mean, not when I talk in the public, I tend to talk, I don't use the word cult so much as I talk in terms of cultic processes and cultic relationships, which I think recognizes two things. It recognizes that we're talking about processes that can exist in any situation, so it's really a matter of degree and intensity. And also, by using the term cultic relationships, we are recognizing that it's not, you know, it's not the old idea of, you know, someone being held to the ground with their brain being opened up and someone pouring stuff into their brain. It's an interaction. There's an interactive process that goes on. That it involves a relationship between the one person and the leader, or one person and the cultic group, or one person and a cult member. That there's an interaction going on there. So I think we've moved toward a far more nuanced recognition of the complexity of this issue, which I think lays the groundwork for greater accessibility in the academic mental health field. Because up until fairly recently, you know, there was most psychologists I spoke to, when I told them what I was doing, they were going, "Oh, that's interesting. That's weird. It has nothing to do with anything I'm doing, but you know, it's kind of interesting." When of course, actually, it most definitely does have to do with what they're doing.
This is not part of this discussion. I'll take it out, but we had this problem in 1980. The word cult, and I suggested cultic because it sounded less. It's like a cult, but not a cult.
Right.
And then Margaret Singer came up with organizations that employ, you know, unethical social and psychological influence, which is too long, you know. So familiar with that problem,
yes.
And we only partially solved it with cultic, and yeah, I don't use it anymore either.
Yeah.
The phrase.
So, you know, in this.
Did cultic groups come after you?
Interestingly, not very intermittently, and not in a very threatening way. We were, Linda and I once did a talk show on a local Philadelphia cult, and when we came back from the studio, our house, you know, the front yard of the house had been toilet papered. Now, this group was led by an expat, a Polish expat, and so it wasn't too hard to figure out who did it because the toilet paper was from Poland. So you know, I mean, we had to clean it up. It was, you know, when the Washington Times first got published, out of nowhere, I had a 1-week subscription, which I took as, we know who you are and we're going to let you know that we know who you are. So for 1 week I received the Washington Times. Nobody else on my block got it. I checked. So for 1 week we received the Washington Times, which I thought was the, you know, Unification Church letting us know that they knew who we were.
Yeah.
The most egregious and stupid attempt to get me into trouble, so to speak, or to come after me, was back in the very early 1990s, when our office was now on Bree Road in Philadelphia. I got, on several occasions, I got calls from people who calling me to get referred to a deprogrammer. And of course, my stance with them was, you know, we'll be glad to work with you, bring the family in, we'll talk about strategies, but no, deprogramming, you know, we do not refer to deprogrammers if you're talking about, you know, the old style of deprogramming, snatching people off the street, putting them, you know, locking them up in a motel room somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. No, we don't deal with that, nor do we know anyone who does, nor do anyone that we know who is ethical and who's ethical in their approach. They don't do that, et cetera, et cetera. So I would be, you know, but if you want to make an appointment, we can discuss the options, you know, and ultimately it's up to you. And of course, they would never make an appointment. But the best part was, you know, at that time there wasn't caller ID, but there was what, star 69 or something, where you could, whoever called you, you could bounce back to that number. It'll call that number that called you, so you didn't see the number, but it would call that number. So every time I got that referral, I would hit star 69, and someone would pick up Church of Scientology. I say it's stupid because they didn't, you know, they should have used an unlisted phone number or something. I mean, crying out loud, that was too easy to figure out.
Yeah.
So I should add that with that the obviously the intent on on the part of Scientology was to get me on records referring somebody to a deprogrammer, which would then possibly result in a complaint to my licensing board. I mean, that's clearly, in my mind, that can be the only explanation for why they were doing that.
Yeah. I see a lot of young people here.
Yeah.
How do they arrive? Do you seek them out, or do they seek you out?
Both. The biggest shift in participation in ICSA events, now, I mean, what we refer to as the first gen, you know, they're my age, and, you know, or maybe a little bit younger, or maybe a little bit older, but, you know, they're basically around my age, or maybe around your age, or whatever. You know, the cults have been around so long that a lot of the people that people are marrying or not. You know, they're in the cults. They're having children in the cults. They're raising those children in the cultic environment. Those children grow up, and fortunately, a good number of them decide this is garbage, and they rebel and they leave the group. And we now refer to those individuals as second generation adults, or SGAs. Lorna Goldberg is proposing, and she's absolutely right, that we start adopting the term multi-generation adults, because, you know, we're getting people in who are third and fourth you know, generation, you know, born in a cultic environment. So what you're seeing in the conferences, you're seeing SGAs. That's who the young people are. They're second generation adults who, mostly through work, I mean, we haven't recruited in the sense. What we've done is been very clear that we are very interested. We want these people in our network. We're interested in working with them. We're interested in learning from them, as well as having them learn from us. And so I think mostly by word of mouth and through conferences and through workshops and support groups, we've now, little by little, we're getting a larger and larger influx of multi-generation adults, or second generation adults, which this is true for every organization that I think has ever existed. You know, when the new generation comes in, the old generation pushes back. and sees the new generation, at least to some degree, in a kind of a fearful way. We don't want change, you know. But they are, thankfully, in my opinion, you know, SGAs are beginning to more and more, you know, gain, you know, leadership and positions within ICSA that allow them to influence policy. And so we have very deliberately made a push, or facilitated a push toward addressing the concerns that SGAs have that are unique. to SGAs. You know, we always talked about, and you know, when working with first generation, of course, you know, what's the goal of exit counseling, or you know, they pass? What was the goal of deprogramming? You know, have the person reject their cult identity and return to their pre-cult identity, right? When you're an SGA, there is no pre-cult identity. That's all they knew. So it's a bit, you know, so the psychology is really quite different. And at least the SGAs that I've met, most of them are just, they're resilient, they're passionate. Sometimes that's really difficult to deal with when their passion disagrees with my passion. They are demanding. You know, some of that may be spillover from the, you know, the millennial generation in general, who tends to be, you know, more or you know, tends to feel a bit more entitled. But again, these are all, you know, I see these as growth enhancing trends. You know, whatever growth you want to talk about, even including, of course, physical growth in adolescence. Any growth that you can think of always involves some pain. So yeah, so there's some pain happening, and and if there weren't, I think that this organization would probably, you know, atrophy and die off.
Well, this is wonderful, wonderful, really terrific. I can say quotable quotes in here.
Oh, okay.
Lengthy quotes. Lengthy quotes.
Bites, yes.
Yeah.
Bites.
Is there anything else I'm leaving out? That you know, the point of this whole thing is to do a history, but also, also to advise your young people in waiting, and they come in. What's this organization like? What kind of things are they looking forward to doing? Getting them ready for leadership.
Yeah, and there is one thing I will add, and this just came to me now, but I think it's something I want to think about and maybe expand on. You know, SGAs come from, by and large, SGAs come from environments where they had no influence on anything related to the group. Where if there was any change, it was top-down change. It was never bottom-up. I mean, you know, cultic groups are inherently undemocratic. So they're very used to that, and they're very pained by that. And then they come to ICSA, and of course we present ourselves as open and democratic, et cetera, and they express their views and their desires and their needs. And they're so used to having that stifled that now I think some of them are over on the other end where, why haven't you changed? I talked to you about this yesterday. Why hasn't the organization changed by now? So I think, you know, one of the things I want to remind or try to speak to in terms of the needs of second generation, multi-generation, is that good change is typically rather slow. You know, most revolutions wind up backfiring, and they wind up, you know, as Pete Townsend of the Who famously said, you know, say hello to the new boss, same as the old boss. And you know, so I absolutely favor SGA involvement. Frankly, I agree with most of their criticisms and most of their suggestions, and I want to convey to them that please hang in there. People, you know, I'm listening to you. I think other people are listening to you. Change will come. It just may not be as fast as you want it. It may not look exactly the way you want it to look.